The wind carried more than dust across the Arizona desert that autumn morning in 1887. It carried the scent of change, of lives about to collide in ways that would challenge everything Thomas McKenna thought he knew about survival, trust, and what it truly means to be human. For 12 years, the grizzled rancher had chosen isolation over companionship, silence over conversation, and the harsh honesty of the wilderness over the complicated lies of civilization. His weathered hands had built fences not just around his property, but around his heart. But on this particular dawn, as he stood on his porch watching 10 figures emerge from the morning haze like spirits materializing from another world, McKenna would discover that some boundaries are meant to be crossed. These weren't the cattle rustlers or drifters he'd grown accustomed to driving off with the business end of his rifle. These were Apache families, men, women, and children whose desperate eyes spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and a fear that ran deeper than any McKenna had ever known. In the space of a heartbeat, a man who had spent over a decade avoiding human connection would be forced to make a choice that would define not just the remainder of his days, but the very essence of who he was beneath all that carefully constructed armor of solitude. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with bullets and bloodshed, but with the simple, terrifying act of opening one's door to strangers who carry nothing but hope and the weight of their own survival. What happened next would become the stuff of legend whispered around campfires for generations. A story of how 10 desperate souls seeking refuge would transform not just a lonely ranch in the middle of nowhere, but the heart of a man who thought he had forgotten how to care about anything beyond his own survival. Thomas McKenna's boots hit the wooden planks of his porch with the same rhythm they had for the past 12 years, steady, purposeful, and solitary. The Arizona sun was already painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, promising another scorching day in September of 1887. At 46, McKenna had the weathered face of a man who had spent more time talking to cattle than to people, more time listening to the wind than to human voices. His hair, once a rich brown, now carried threads of silver that caught the early morning light like wire. The ranch stretched out before him in all directions, a testament to back-breaking labor and stubborn determination. What had started as a modest homestead had grown into nearly 3,000 acres of some of the harshest but most beautiful land in the Arizona territory. McKenna had chosen this particular piece of earth not for its convenience or its promise of easy prosperity, but for its magnificent isolation. The nearest neighbor lived 47 miles to the east, and the small town of Dos Caballos was a hard day's ride to the north. McKenna preferred it that way. People were complicated, unpredictable, and ultimately disappointing. Cattle were honest in their needs: water, grass, and protection from predators. The land itself demanded only respect and hard work. There were no lies in the desert, no false promises or broken hearts, just the simple, brutal truth of survival. His morning routine never varied. Coffee first, thick and black, brewed in the same pot his father had used during his own ranching days in Texas. Then a walk around the property to check on the water sources and look for signs of trouble. McKenna had learned to read the land like other men read newspapers. A buzzard circling in an unusual pattern might mean a sick animal. Tracks near the well could indicate anything from javelinas to something more dangerous. The desert spoke to those who knew how to listen, and McKenna had become fluent in its language. On this particular morning, something felt different. The usual chorus of morning sounds seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath. McKenna's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver that rarely left his side. 12 years of isolation had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. He had learned to trust the feeling that crawled up the back of his neck when something wasn't right. The cattle in the near pasture were restless, their heads raised and turned toward the eastern hills. McKenna followed their gaze and saw nothing but the familiar landscape of scattered mesquite and towering saguaro cacti. But the animals knew something he didn't, and their unease infected him with a familiar wariness. McKenna's isolation hadn't been a sudden decision, but rather a gradual retreat from a world that had taken too much from him. He had arrived in Arizona territory in 1875, a young man filled with dreams of building something lasting with his wife, Sarah, and their infant daughter, Emma. They had plans, a ranch, a family, a future that stretched out like the endless Arizona sky. But the desert was an unforgiving teacher, and McKenna had learned its lessons the hard way. The fever that took Sarah and Emma during their first winter had also taken something essential from McKenna himself. He had buried them on a small rise overlooking the valley. Under 2 crosses, he had carved himself from oak wood he had hauled from the mountains. After that, he had simply stopped expecting anything good from life. The ranch became his obsession, his penance, and his prison all at once. He drove himself with the kind of intensity that worried even the most hardened cowboys who occasionally passed through looking for work. McKenna worked from dawn to dusk, building fences, digging wells, and expanding his herd with the single-minded focus of a man trying to outrun his own memories. Over the years, various people had tried to draw him back into the world of human connection. Neighboring ranchers had invited him to community gatherings. The preacher from Dos Caballos had made the long journey to check on his spiritual welfare. Even a few hardy women, both widows and spinsters, had made their interest known through various intermediaries. McKenna had politely but firmly declined all such overtures. He had convinced himself that he was better off alone, that isolation was not just his preference, but his protection. People died, people left, people disappointed you when you needed them most. But the land endured. The cattle required only simple, honest care. There were no complicated emotions to navigate, no hearts to break or be broken by. His daily routine reflected this philosophy. He rose before dawn, worked until exhaustion forced him to stop, and fell asleep each night to the sound of coyotes singing in the distance. He spoke only to his animals, and then only when necessary. He had grown comfortable with silence, with his own company, with the predictable rhythms of ranch life. McKenna had built his isolation carefully, like a fortress. His ranch was deliberately located far from established trails. He discouraged visitors with a stern demeanor and a reputation for preferring his own company. The few travelers who did stumble onto his land were treated with cool politeness and sent on their way as quickly as possible. But on this morning, as he stood on his porch watching the eastern horizon with growing unease, McKenna felt the weight of his solitude in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The silence that usually comforted him now seemed oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Even his dog, a grizzled mix named Bear who was almost as antisocial as his owner, was pacing nervously at the edge of the porch. The sun climbed higher, and, with it, the temperature began its relentless ascent toward what would surely be another scorching day. McKenna went about his morning chores with mechanical efficiency, but his attention kept drifting back to that strange feeling of unease. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the desert itself seemed to be waiting. As he filled the water troughs, McKenna found himself thinking about the stories he had heard in town during his rare visits for supplies. Tales of Apache bands still roaming the territory, despite the government's efforts to relocate all the tribes to reservations. Most of these stories were probably exaggerated, fueled by fear and prejudice rather than fact. But McKenna knew enough about the Apache to respect their skills as survivors in this harsh land. He had encountered Apache people before in the early days when he and Sarah had first arrived. They had been neither the savage killers of newspaper accounts nor the noble savages of dime novels, but simply people trying to make their way in a world that was changing faster than anyone could adapt to. McKenna had found them to be skilled, intelligent, and deeply connected to the land in ways that he was only beginning to understand. But those days were long past. The Apache Wars had been declared officially over, though everyone knew that scattered bands still refused to accept confinement to the reservations. McKenna had heard whispers of families who had slipped away from San Carlos or other government camps, choosing the uncertain freedom of the desert over the certain misery of supervised captivity. As the morning progressed, McKenna's unease grew stronger rather than fading. The cattle continued to act skittish, and even a usually fearless McKenna found himself checking and rechecking his weapons. He carried a Winchester rifle in addition to his sidearm, and he made sure both were loaded and ready for whatever might come. It was just after 10 o'clock when he finally saw them. They appeared like mirages at first, wavering figures emerging from the heat shimmer that already danced across the desert floor. McKenna grabbed his field glasses and focused on the approaching group, his heart rate quickening as the details became clear. 10 people, 3 men, 3 women, and 4 children. They moved with the careful, measured pace of people who had been traveling for a very long time and were very tired. Their clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache garments and pieces of white man's clothing, all of it worn and dusty from hard travel. They carried very little, just small bundles and water containers that looked nearly empty. McKenna watched them approach his property line, his mind racing through his options. He could hide, wait for them to pass by. He could ride out and warn them off, make it clear they weren't welcome. He could simply wait and see what they wanted, ready to defend his property if necessary. What he found himself doing was none of those things. Instead, he stood on his porch, rifle held loosely but ready, and watched as the small group of refugees walked directly toward his house. They had clearly seen him, and they were coming to him deliberately, purposefully. As they drew closer, McKenna could see the exhaustion etched into their faces, the way the children leaned against the adults for support, the careful way the men scanned the area for threats, even as they approached what might be either salvation or disaster. These weren't raiders or troublemakers. These were families pushed to the edge of endurance and beyond. The group stopped about 50 yards from the porch, close enough to talk, but far enough to run if necessary. One of the men, tall and lean with graying hair, stepped forward slightly. His dark eyes met McKenna's across the dusty yard. And in that moment, two very different worlds hung in the balance. The Apache man raised his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and request. He spoke in accented but clear English, his voice carrying the weight of desperation carefully controlled. "We are hungry," he said simply. "Our children need water." McKenna felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of spring water. These weren't the savage raiders of frontier nightmares. They were human beings at the end of their rope, asking for the most basic necessities of life. And they were asking him, Thomas McKenna, who had spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of human complication. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap in either direction. McKenna was acutely aware that his response in the next few seconds would determine not just what happened to these 10 desperate souls, but what happened to his own carefully constructed world of isolation and self-protection. The children were looking at him with the kind of hope that was almost painful to witness. The adults were trying to hide their desperation behind dignity, but McKenna could see the truth in their posture, in the way they held themselves ready for rejection, but still daring to ask for mercy. For 12 years, McKenna had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. All his walls, all his defenses, all his careful avoidance of human connection had been building toward this single point in time when he would have to choose between the safety of solitude and the terrifying risk of caring about someone other than himself. The sun beat down mercilessly as the moment stretched on, and McKenna realized that whatever choice he made now would define not just this day, but the rest of his life. McKenna's throat felt as dry as the desert sand beneath his boots as he stared at the 10 figures waiting in his yard. Every instinct he had developed over 12 years of isolation screamed at him to send them away, to protect the sanctuary he had built through sweat, blood, and deliberate loneliness. But there was something in the way the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, swayed on her feet that made his carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. "Water's in the well," he heard himself saying, his voice rough from disuse and surprise at his own words. "Help yourselves." The relief that washed over the group's faces was so profound that McKenna had to look away. He had forgotten how powerful it could be to ease another person's suffering, how it felt to be the answer to someone's desperate prayer. The feeling was both warming and terrifying. The tall Apache man nodded gravely. "I'm called Joseph by the white men. My people know me as Nantan Lupon." He gestured toward his companions. "These are my relatives. We thank you for your kindness." McKenna watched as the group moved toward his well with careful dignity, despite their obvious desperation. The women helped the children drink first, making sure each small mouth got its fill before taking careful sips themselves. The men waited last, though McKenna could see their own thirst in the way their eyes followed every drop of water. "There's jerky in the smokehouse," McKenna found himself saying, "and some hardtack." He wasn't sure what was driving these words from his mouth, but they seemed to have a will of their own. Joseph studied McKenna's face for a long moment before responding. "You are generous to strangers. This is not common in these times." McKenna shifted uncomfortably under the man's direct gaze. It's just food and water. Nothing more. But even as he said it, McKenna knew it wasn't true. In the harsh reality of the Arizona territory, food and water weren't just anything. They were the difference between life and death, hope and despair. And for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he had chosen to offer both to these desperate travelers. As the Apache families settled in whatever shade they could find near the well, McKenna retreated to his porch and tried to figure out what he had just gotten himself into. His hands shook slightly as he rolled a cigarette, a habit he had picked up during the long, lonely evenings when silence became too heavy to bear. The children's laughter drifted across the yard as they played quietly in the dust, and the sound hit McKenna like a physical blow. He hadn't heard children's voices on his property since Emma had died 12 years ago. The memory of his daughter's giggle, so similar to what he was hearing now, brought tears to his eyes that he quickly wiped away. Joseph approached the porch slowly, his movements careful and respectful. "May I speak with you?" McKenna nodded, not trusting his voice. The Apache man settled onto the ground in front of the porch, maintaining the respectful distance that his people had learned was necessary when dealing with white landowners. "We have been traveling for many days," Joseph began, "running from soldiers who would take us back to San Carlos." He spat in the dust at the mention of the reservation. "That place is death for my people. Slow death, but death just the same." McKenna had heard stories about the conditions at San Carlos and other reservations. Disease, malnutrition, and despair were common. The government solution to the Apache problem seemed designed to break the spirit of one of the most resilient peoples in North America. "Where are you headed?" McKenna asked. "Mexico," Joseph replied. "There's still free bands there in the Sierra Madre. It is a hard journey, but there's hope in Mexico." McKenna nodded slowly. Mexico was still hundreds of miles to the south, through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent. For a group traveling on foot, carrying children, it would be an almost impossible journey. "We will not stay long," Joseph continued, reading the concern in McKenna's face. "Just long enough to rest and gather strength for the road ahead." "How long?" McKenna asked. Joseph's dark eyes met his. "A few days, maybe a week, no longer." McKenna felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. A few days might not seem like much, but in the current political climate, harboring runaway Apache could be seen as treason. The territorial government had made it clear that anyone aiding hostile Indians would face severe consequences. But looking at the exhausted families in his yard, McKenna found it impossible to see hostiles. He saw hungry children, tired mothers, and desperate men trying to protect their families in a world that had left them with no good choices. "The soldiers," McKenna said carefully. "How close are they?" "3 days behind us. Maybe 4, Joseph replied. They stopped at the last waterhole to rest their horses. "We have been moving at night, hiding during the day." McKenna's mind raced through the implications. If the soldiers were tracking this group, his ranch would eventually be searched. The Territorial Army didn't take kindly to civilians who interfered with their operations, especially when those operations involved recapturing escaped Apache. "They'll come here eventually," McKenna said. "Yes," Joseph agreed. "That is why we will not stay long. We do not wish to bring trouble to one who has shown us kindness." The simple dignity of the man's words hit McKenna harder than any threat could have. Joseph was offering to protect McKenna from the consequences of his own generosity, even though it meant pushing his exhausted people back into the desert before they were ready. "The nearest water after this is 30 miles south," McKenna said quietly. "We know." Joseph's voice carried the weight of that knowledge. McKenna looked out at the group, resting in the shade of his few trees. The youngest child had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her small face peaceful for the first time since they had arrived. One of the women was tending to blisters on an older boy's feet, her movements gentle and practiced. The men sat in careful alertness, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. These weren't the savage raiders of newspaper stories. They were families doing whatever it took to stay together and stay free. McKenna found himself remembering his own desperate journey to Arizona after the war, when he and Sarah had been running from their own set of demons. He remembered the kindness of strangers who had helped them along the way, the critical difference between hope and despair that simple human decency could make. "There's a box canyon about 5 miles east of here," McKenna heard himself saying, "hidden from the main trails. Good water, decent grass. If someone wanted to rest up for a week or so before continuing south, it would be a good place. Joseph's eyes widened slightly. You would show us this place? McKenna nodded, surprising himself. I'd do more than that. I'd bring supplies. Food, blankets, whatever you need for the journey ahead. Why? Joseph asked simply. You do not know us. Our presence here brings you danger. It was a fair question, and McKenna wished he had a simple answer. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in his own grief, his own guilt, and a growing recognition that his 12 years of isolation had been as much about running away as about protecting himself. My wife and daughter died here, McKenna said finally. First winter we were here. Fever. He paused, surprised by how difficult it still was to say those words out loud. I've spent 12 years thinking that if I just stayed away from people, it wouldn't hurt so much. Joseph waited patiently for McKenna to continue. Maybe I was wrong, McKenna said quietly. Maybe the hurt isn't something you run from. Maybe it's something you carry, and the only way to make it mean anything is to help carry someone else's hurt too. The Apache man nodded slowly. Grief is a heavy burden, but shared burdens are lighter than those carried alone. As the afternoon wore on, McKenna found himself drawn into conversations with his unexpected guests. The women were skilled at making much from little, turning his basic supplies into nourishing meals that filled the air with unfamiliar but appetizing aromas. The children, once they had recovered from their exhaustion, began to explore the ranch with the cautious curiosity of young people who had learned to be constantly alert for danger. One of the older boys, perhaps 14, was fascinated by McKenna's cattle operation. He asked careful, intelligent questions about breeding, grazing patterns, and water management. McKenna found himself explaining techniques he had learned through hard experience, sharing knowledge he hadn't realized he possessed. You understand the land, the boy said as they watched the cattle moving toward the evening water. The land taught me, McKenna replied. Same way it teaches everyone who listens. Not everyone listens, the boy observed with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much for his age. That evening, as they gathered around a small fire, McKenna experienced something he hadn't felt in 12 years, the warmth of human community. The Apache families shared stories, songs, and gentle laughter that filled the desert air with life. McKenna contributed little to the conversation, but he found himself listening with an intensity that surprised him. Joseph spoke of their life before the reservation, when his band had moved freely through the mountains and deserts of their homeland. He described hunting parties and gathering expeditions, ceremonies that connected his people to the spiritual forces of the land, and a way of life that had sustained his ancestors for countless generations. The white men think we are primitive, Joseph said, his voice carrying no bitterness despite the injustice of his situation. They do not understand that we have been learning from this land for 1,000 years. They see emptiness where we see abundance, wasteland where we see home. McKenna nodded. He was beginning to understand that his 12 years in the desert had taught him only a fraction of what these people knew instinctively about survival and connection to the land. As the fire died down and the families prepared to sleep under the stars, McKenna made his decision final. We'll go to the canyon tomorrow, he said. I'll help you get ready for Mexico. Joseph gripped McKenna's hand in the Apache way, a gesture that carried more weight than any contract or formal agreement. Your generosity will be remembered, he said. My grandchildren will know of the white rancher who chose kindness over fear. That night, McKenna lay awake listening to the soft sounds of the sleeping families in his yard. For the first time in 12 years, his ranch felt alive with more than just his own solitary presence. The silence that had once been his refuge now seemed empty compared to the quiet breathing of people who trusted him enough to sleep peacefully on his land. McKenna realized that in offering refuge to these desperate families, he had also offered himself something he hadn't even known he was missing, the chance to matter to someone else's survival, to be part of something larger than his own carefully guarded solitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and the need to make good on promises that could cost him everything he had built. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet presence of people who had chosen to trust him, McKenna felt something he had thought was lost forever. The fragile, precious warmth of human connection, and the knowledge that he was no longer facing the world alone. Dawn broke with a pink and gold intensity that promised another scorching day, but McKenna felt more energized than he had in years. The Apache families were already stirring, their movements quiet and efficient as they prepared for whatever the day might bring. McKenna watched them from his porch, noting how naturally they worked together, how even the children contributed to the group's survival without being told what needed doing. The plan was simple but dangerous. McKenna would lead them to the hidden canyon he had discovered during his second year on the ranch, a place so well concealed that even he sometimes had trouble finding it. The journey would require traveling across open ground in daylight, making them visible to anyone who might be watching. But waiting for darkness would cost them precious time they couldn't afford to lose. McKenna loaded his wagon with supplies that might mean the difference between life and death for the refugees. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, and dried beef filled one side of the wagon bed. Blankets, cooking pots, and medical supplies took up the rest. It was more than he could easily spare, but McKenna found himself thinking about the long journey still ahead of these families, and adding one more item, then another. "You give too much," Joseph observed as McKenna secured the load. "We cannot repay such generosity." "Not looking for repayment," McKenna replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. All he knew was that for the first time in 12 years, his actions felt important beyond his own survival. The journey to the canyon took them across terrain that McKenna knew intimately, but that would be treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with its hidden dangers. They traveled in single file, with McKenna leading and Joseph bringing up the rear, both men constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The children bore the hardship with remarkable stoicism, though McKenna could see the effort it cost them. The youngest girl, who had introduced herself shyly as Maria, rode in the wagon when her exhaustion became too obvious to ignore. She reminded McKenna painfully of Emma, though Maria's dark hair and solemn brown eyes were nothing like his daughter's blonde curls and blue eyes. As they traveled, McKenna found himself learning more about his companions. The woman tending to Maria was her grandmother, Elena, whose weather-beaten hands spoke of a lifetime of hard work and harder choices. Two of the men were brothers, Roberto and Carlos, whose wives and children made up the rest of the group. They had been farmers on the reservation, trying to make the transition from their traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle to the agricultural existence the government demanded. "They said we must become like white men," Roberto explained as they rested in the shade of a towering saguaro. "But the land they gave us was no good for farming. Salt and rocks, nothing more. When the corn failed for the third time, they said it was because we were lazy, not because the earth was dead." McKenna nodded grimly. He had seen the reservation lands during one of his rare trips to Tucson for supplies. The government had allocated some of the worst agricultural land in the territory to the Apache, then blamed them for failing to make it productive. When the children began to grow thin, Elena added softly, "We knew we had to leave. Better to die free than to watch our little ones waste away in that place of broken promises." The canyon, when they finally reached it, was exactly as McKenna remembered, a hidden jewel carved into the desert floor by centuries of flash floods. The entrance was so narrow that it was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, towering walls provided shade and protection from the wind. A spring fed a small pool of clear water, and enough grass grew in the protected space to support the small herd of horses the Apache had somehow managed to bring with them. "This is a sacred place," Joseph said quietly as they entered the canyon. "The spirits are strong here." McKenna felt it too, though he might not have described it in the same terms. There was something peaceful about the canyon that went beyond its practical advantages. The walls seemed to hold not just water and grass, but a sense of sanctuary that was almost palpable. The Apache families set to work immediately, establishing a temporary camp with the efficiency of people who had been forced to become experts at starting over. McKenna was impressed by their skill at creating comfort and security from almost nothing. Within hours, they had transformed the canyon floor into a well-organized settlement, complete with sleeping areas, cooking spaces, and even a small corral for their horses. McKenna spent the day teaching them everything he knew about the local area: where to find water, which plants were edible, how to read the weather signs that meant flash floods were coming. In return, he learned things about desert survival that his 12 years of experience hadn't taught him. The Apache knew which cacti produced the most nutritious fruit, how to find hidden springs by watching the flight patterns of birds, and dozens of other skills that had kept their people alive in this harsh environment for generations. As evening approached, McKenna prepared to return to his ranch. The plan was for the Apache families to rest in the canyon for a week while he monitored the situation and gathered additional supplies for their journey to Mexico. It was a dangerous game they were all playing, but it seemed to be their only option for survival. "The soldiers will come to your ranch," Joseph warned as McKenna prepared to leave. "What will you tell them?" McKenna had been thinking about that all day. "The truth," he said finally, "that 10 Apache came through asking for water, that I gave them some, and that they continued south. And if they search for signs of where we went," McKenna pointed toward the south in the opposite direction from the canyon. "I'll show them the tracks I'm about to make with my wagon. Trail that leads to the old mine road, then disappears on the rock flats." It was a simple plan, but it might work if the soldiers weren't particularly motivated to spend days tracking refugees through some of the most inhospitable country in North America. That night, McKenna returned to his ranch and tried to resume his normal routine. But everything felt different now. The silence that had once comforted him now seemed empty. The solitude that had been his refuge now felt like isolation. Even his dog Bear seemed to sense the change, whining softly and looking toward the east as if he missed the voices and activity of the Apache families. McKenna spent the evening on his porch, smoking and thinking about the choices he had made. By harboring the refugees, he had violated both territorial law and federal policy. If he were caught, he could face imprisonment or worse. His ranch, the only thing he had left of his life with Sarah, could be confiscated. He could lose everything he had worked for over the past 12 years. But as he sat in the gathering darkness, McKenna realized that everything didn't feel like very much anymore. What good was a successful ranch if it was built on a foundation of deliberate indifference to human suffering? What was the value of security purchased at the cost of turning away from people in desperate need? The second day brought the soldiers. McKenna saw the dust cloud long before he could make out individual riders. 5 men in blue uniforms, riding hard toward his ranch with the grim determination of people who had been following a cold trail for too long. McKenna checked his weapons, composed his face into the neutral expression he had perfected over years of discouraging visitors, and waited on his porch. The sergeant was a grizzled man named Patterson whom McKenna recognized from previous encounters. He was neither cruel nor particularly intelligent, just a career soldier doing a job he probably didn't think about too deeply. "McKenna," Patterson said without dismounting, "we're tracking a band of Apache that broke out of San Carlos 2 weeks ago. 10 individuals, including women and children. You seen anything?" "Matter of fact, I have," McKenna replied calmly. "Group came through 3 days ago. Asked for water." Patterson's eyes sharpened with interest. "You gave it to them?" "Wasn't about to let children die of thirst on my property," McKenna said. "Gave them water and some food, then sent them on their way." "Which way did they go?" McKenna pointed south toward the mine road. "That direction. Said something about Mexico." Patterson nodded grimly. "Show me where." McKenna saddled his horse and led the soldiers to the false trail he had created. The tracks were clear enough to follow, and McKenna had done a good job of making them look like they belonged to a group of 10 people traveling on foot. The trail led across a rocky flat where tracks would naturally disappear, exactly as McKenna had planned. "Crafty bastards," one of the younger soldiers muttered as they stared at the place where the tracks vanished. "Could have gone anywhere from here." Patterson studied the terrain with the eye of a man who had spent years chasing Apache across the desert. "They'll head for water," he said finally. "Next reliable source is 30 miles south. We can catch them if we push hard." McKenna watched the soldiers ride away with mixed feelings. Relief that his deception had worked, but also anxiety about what would happen when Patterson's patrol didn't find the Apache families at the next water source. Eventually, the sergeant would realize he had been misled, and when he did, he would remember exactly who had provided the false information. That afternoon, McKenna rode out to the canyon to check on the refugees. He found them thriving in their temporary sanctuary. The children were playing games in the shade while the adults worked on preparations for their continued journey. Elena had found wild herbs and was preparing medicines for the road ahead. The men were crafting new moccasins and repairing equipment that had been damaged during their flight from the reservation. The soldiers came, McKenna reported to Joseph. "I sent them south toward the mine road." Joseph nodded gravely. "They'll give us time, but not much. They will discover the deception eventually." "How much time do you need?" 3 more days to rest and prepare. Then, we continue toward Mexico. McKenna spent the next hour discussing the best route south with Joseph and the other men. They pored over McKenna's crude maps and shared their knowledge of the terrain ahead. The journey would be dangerous under the best of circumstances, but their chances were improving with each day of rest and preparation. As McKenna prepared to return to his ranch, little Maria approached him shyly. In her small hands, she held a doll made from scraps of cloth and decorated with tiny beads. "For your daughter," she said solemnly, holding out the gift. McKenna felt his throat constrict. "I don't have a daughter, sweetheart." Maria looked confused. "But you said—" Elena appeared at her granddaughter's side. "Maria heard you talking about your daughter yesterday. She wanted to make something for her." McKenna knelt down, so he was at the child's eye level. "My daughter died a long time ago," he said gently. "But I think she would have loved this doll very much. Would it be all right if I kept it to remember her by?" Maria nodded solemnly and placed the doll carefully in McKenna's weathered hands. The small gift weighed almost nothing, but it felt as heavy as the world to a man who had spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional connection. That night, McKenna sat on his porch holding Maria's doll and thinking about the choices that had led him to this point. In 3 days, the Apache families would continue their journey toward an uncertain future in Mexico. He would return to his solitary existence, his carefully ordered world of cattle and silence and emotional safety. But something fundamental had changed inside him during these past few days. The walls he had built around his heart were cracking, and through those cracks was flowing a warmth he had almost forgotten existed. For the first time since Sarah and Emma's death, McKenna was beginning to believe that the risk of caring about others might be worth taking, even if it meant opening himself up to the possibility of loss and pain. The doll sat on his mantel that night, a small reminder that even in the midst of great hardship, there was still room in the human heart for generosity, hope, and love. The attack came at dawn on the 4th day. McKenna was feeding his horses when he heard the distant crack of gunfire echoing from the direction of the canyon. His blood turned to ice as the sound reached him. Not the controlled volleys of soldiers, but the desperate, scattered shots of people fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Without thinking, McKenna grabbed his rifle and ammunition, saddled his fastest horse, and rode hard toward the canyon. Behind him, his dog Bear followed at a dead run, as if sensing the urgency of the situation. The early morning air carried more gunshots, punctuated by shouts, and the sound of horses moving fast across rocky ground. As McKenna approached the canyon entrance, he could see smoke rising from inside the hidden sanctuary. His worst fears were being realized. Somehow, the soldiers had found the Apache families. The question now was whether anyone was still alive to be saved. McKenna dismounted and approached the canyon entrance on foot, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. What he saw when he peered over the rim made his stomach clench with rage and despair. Patterson's patrol had indeed found the canyon, but they weren't alone. At least 15 men in civilian clothes had joined them, turning what should have been a simple arrest into something that looked more like a military operation. The Apache families had taken cover behind rocks and makeshift barriers, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. McKenna could see Joseph and the other men returning fire with old rifles and pistols, while the women and children huddled in whatever protection they could find. The spring that made the canyon such a perfect refuge had become a trap. There was only one way out, and it was blocked by armed men. McKenna's military experience from the Civil War came flooding back as he assessed the situation. The Apache were brave and skilled, but they were running low on ammunition and had no escape route. It was only a matter of time before their position became untenable. What happened next would haunt McKenna for the rest of his life, though not for the reasons he expected. Instead of retreating to safety and avoiding involvement in a fight that wasn't technically his, McKenna found himself thinking about Maria's shy smile when she had given him the doll. He thought about Elena's weathered hands preparing medicine for a journey she might never complete. He thought about Joseph's quiet dignity and the way the children had laughed around his campfire just 3 nights ago. These people had trusted him. They had accepted his help and his sanctuary, and now they were dying because he hadn't been smart enough or careful enough to keep them safe. McKenna worked his way around to a position overlooking the canyon floor, where he could see the full scope of the battle. Patterson was shouting orders to his men, trying to coordinate an advance that would end the standoff quickly. The civilian volunteers were less disciplined, firing wildly and wasting ammunition, but their sheer numbers were making the difference. From his elevated position, McKenna had clear shots at several of the attackers. His hands shook as he raised his rifle, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. Once he fired the first shot, there would be no going back. He would be branded an outlaw, a traitor, a man who had chosen a side with savages against his own people. But as he watched 8-year-old Carlos Jr. crying silently while his mother tried to shield him from flying bullets, McKenna realized that his choice had been made days ago when he first offered water to desperate strangers. Everything since then had been inevitable. McKenna's first shot took down one of the civilian volunteers who was advancing on the Apache position. His second shot sent Patterson diving for cover, though the sergeant wasn't hit. The sudden attack from above threw the entire assault into confusion as the soldiers and civilians tried to figure out where this new threat was coming from. "Federal officer," Patterson shouted toward McKenna's position, though he couldn't see exactly where the shots had come from. "Cease fire immediately or face charges of treason." McKenna's answer was another carefully aimed shot that sent one of the volunteers scrambling for better cover. He had learned to shoot during some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, and his skills hadn't deteriorated much despite 12 years of relative peace. The distraction gave Joseph and his men the chance they needed to reorganize their defense. They used McKenna's covering fire to move to better positions, and soon they were putting pressure on Patterson's men from multiple directions. What had been a simple mop-up operation was rapidly turning into a real firefight. But McKenna knew that his intervention, while dramatic, couldn't change the fundamental math of the situation. The Apache families were still outnumbered, still running low on ammunition, and still trapped in a canyon with no escape route. All McKenna had done was buy them time, and probably not very much of it. That's when he heard the sound of more horses approaching from the north, reinforcements for Patterson's patrol. McKenna's heart sank as he realized that instead of helping, his intervention might have sealed the fate of the people he was trying to save. But as the new riders came into view, McKenna realized they weren't soldiers. They were Apache, at least 20 warriors riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. For a moment, McKenna couldn't understand how they had found this place or why they were here. Then he saw Joseph stand up from behind his barricade and fire 3 shots into the air in a specific pattern. It was a signal, McKenna realized. Joseph had somehow gotten word to other Apache bands about their situation. The families hadn't been as alone as McKenna had thought. The arrival of Apache reinforcements transformed the entire situation. Suddenly, Patterson's men found themselves caught between 2 forces, with no clear escape route of their own. The civilian volunteers, who had signed up for what they thought would be an easy fight against trapped refugees, began to panic as they realized they were facing experienced warriors who knew this terrain intimately. "Fall back," Patterson shouted to his men. "Regroup with the horses." But the Apache warriors had already anticipated this move. They had positioned themselves to block the most obvious retreat routes, turning the hunters into the hunted with brutal efficiency. McKenna watched from his position as the carefully planned military operation dissolved into chaos. The battle that followed was brief, but intense. The Apache warriors fought with the skill and desperation of people defending their families, while Patterson's men fought with the growing realization that they had stumbled into a situation far beyond their ability to control. When the shooting finally stopped, 6 of Patterson's men lay dead or wounded on the canyon floor. The sergeant himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but was still alive. Most of the civilian volunteers had fled at the first sign that the fight was turning against them, abandoning their wounded comrades in their haste to escape. McKenna made his way down into the canyon, where he was greeted by Joseph with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You save our lives," Joseph said simply, "but you have also destroyed your own." McKenna looked around at the aftermath of the battle. 3 of the Apache defenders had been wounded, but none killed. The children were shaken, but unharmed. Elena was already tending to the injured with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout their ordeal. "Patterson recognized me," McKenna said. "Even if he doesn't make it back to report, someone will figure out who was shooting from up there." Joseph nodded grimly. "You cannot return to your ranch. The soldiers will be looking for you now." McKenna had already reached the same conclusion. In the space of one morning, he had thrown away everything he had built over 12 years. His ranch, his carefully constructed isolation, his safety, all of it was gone. He was now as much a fugitive as the Apache families he had tried to help. But as he looked around at the faces of the people whose lives he had helped save, McKenna found that he felt no regret. For the first time since Sarah and Emma's death, he had acted with purpose beyond his own survival. He had chosen connection over isolation, courage over safety, and love over fear. What happens now? McKenna asked. The leader of the Apache reinforcements, a man named Cochillo, approached them. He was younger than Joseph, but carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. Now we all go to Mexico, Cochillo said. Together, McKenna looked back toward his ranch, invisible from this distance, but still representing everything he had called home for over a decade. Somewhere in his house, Maria's doll sat on the mantel, a small reminder of why he had made the choices that led to this moment. I don't speak Apache, McKenna said. I don't know your customs or your ways. Joseph smiled, the first time McKenna had seen the man truly smile since they had met. You know the most important thing, he said. You know how to choose what is right over what is safe. As they prepared to leave the canyon forever, McKenna gathered what supplies he could carry and said goodbye to the only life he had known as an adult. The Apache families were ready to travel again, their brief rest having restored their strength for the long journey ahead. Little Maria approached McKenna as he loaded his saddlebags. Are you coming with us? She asked. McKenna knelt down to her level. Yes, he said. I think I am. She smiled and took his hand with the unconscious trust of a child who had already accepted him as part of her extended family. In that moment, McKenna realized that he wasn't losing his old life. He was finally beginning to live a new one. The group that rode south from the canyon that day was very different from the one that had arrived at McKenna's ranch less than a week earlier. It was larger, better armed, and more confident. But more importantly, it included a man who had learned that true security didn't come from walls and isolation, but from the courage to connect with others and the willingness to risk everything for what mattered most. As they rode toward Mexico and an uncertain future, McKenna felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years, the warm certainty of belonging somewhere and to someone. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but he would no longer be facing it alone. The journey to Mexico took them through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent, but McKenna discovered that traveling with the Apache was like having the desert itself as a guide. They knew where to find water in places that looked barren to his untrained eye, which plants could provide nutrition when hunting was poor, and how to read the subtle signs that warned of flash floods, dangerous wildlife, or hostile pursuit. 3 weeks after leaving the canyon, they crossed the Rio Grande at a remote ford that Cochillo's band had used for generations. Mexico spread before them like a promise of freedom, though McKenna knew that their troubles were far from over. The Mexican government was no more friendly to Apache bands than the American authorities, but the vast Sierra Madre Mountains offered hiding places that had sheltered free Apache for decades. McKenna's integration into Apache society proved to be both easier and harder than he had expected. His practical skills with horses, cattle, and firearms were immediately valuable to a people who had been forced to become experts at adaptation. His willingness to share his knowledge freely, without expecting special treatment or deference, earned him respect more quickly than he had thought possible. But learning to live as part of a close-knit community after 12 years of deliberate isolation required adjustments that sometimes left him feeling overwhelmed. The Apache had no concept of privacy as McKenna understood it. Decisions were made collectively, resources were shared according to need rather than ownership, and everyone was expected to contribute to the welfare of the group before considering their own desires. The children helped ease his transition in ways that surprised him. Maria, in particular, seemed to have appointed herself as his cultural guide, patiently explaining Apache customs and correcting his clumsy attempts at their language. Her grandmother, Elena, took over his education in practical matters like traditional food preparation, herbal medicine, and the intricate social protocols that govern daily life. You learn quickly for a white man, Elena observed one evening as McKenna successfully prepared a traditional dish under her supervision. But you still think too much like someone who lives alone. It was an accurate assessment. McKenna was discovering that his years of isolation had left him with habits of mind that didn't serve him well in a community setting. He was accustomed to making decisions based solely on his own needs and preferences to working at his own pace without considering how his actions affected others, and to maintaining emotional distance as a form of self-protection. The Apache way of life required constant awareness of the group's needs, willingness to subordinate individual desires to collective welfare, and emotional openness that left McKenna feeling vulnerable in ways he had forgotten were possible. But it also offered rewards he had never imagined during his years of self-imposed exile. For the first time since Sarah and Emma's death, McKenna felt truly useful beyond his own survival. His knowledge of ranching helped the Apache adapt their traditional hunting and gathering techniques to include limited agriculture in their mountain refuges. His experience with American military tactics proved valuable when planning defenses against potential government raids. Most importantly, his willingness to risk everything to help strangers earned him a place in the community's heart that no amount of practical skill could have achieved. Joseph became not just a friend, but something approaching a brother. The two men spent long hours discussing everything from practical matters of survival to deeper questions about the nature of courage, loyalty, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. McKenna found himself learning as much from Joseph's philosophical perspective as from his survival skills. You wonder sometimes if he made the right choice. Joseph observed one evening as they sat by a small fire in their mountain camp. I see in your face when you think no one is watching. McKenna nodded. Sometimes I do wonder. I gave up everything I'd worked for. My ranch, my independence, my security. And what did you gain? McKenna looked around the camp, where families were sharing the evening meal, children were playing games in the firelight, and adults were discussing plans for the next day's activities. Everyone had a role, everyone mattered, and everyone was part of something larger than themselves. I gained a life worth living, he said finally. 6 months after crossing into Mexico, their mountain refuge was discovered by a Mexican military patrol. The Mexican soldiers were less aggressive than their American counterparts, but they made it clear that the Apache presence was not welcome. Another move became necessary, deeper into the Sierra Madre, to places so remote that even the Mexican government couldn't be bothered to pursue them. McKenna's transformation during this period was remarkable even to himself. The man who had once valued independence above all else became an integral part of community that made no important decisions without extensive consultation. The rancher who had barely spoken to another human being for months at a time became fluent enough in Apache to participate in the complex discussions that governed band life. Most importantly, the man who had closed his heart after losing his wife and daughter learned to love again, not romantically, but with the deep, familial affection that bound the Apache community together. Elena became the mother he had lost as a young man. Joseph became the brother he had never had. Maria and the other children became the nieces and nephews he had never expected to know. The pain of losing Sarah and Emma never completely disappeared, but it changed character. Instead of being a weight that dragged him down into isolation, it became part of the foundation that enabled him to understand and share the grief of others. When Elena spoke of children lost to disease and war, McKenna could offer more than sympathy. He could offer the understanding that came from his own experience with devastating loss. 2 years after leaving his ranch, McKenna married a young Apache widow named Ayanna, whose husband had been killed during their escape from the reservation. It was not a passionate romance, but rather the deep, steady affection of two people who had both learned to value security and companionship over the intense emotions of youth. Ayanna brought her own 8-year-old son, Naeli, into the marriage, and McKenna discovered that he could be a father again without betraying the memory of Emma. Different children needed different kinds of love, and his heart proved to be more expandable than he had ever imagined. The Apache band grew and prospered in their mountain refuge, developing new survival strategies that combined traditional knowledge with innovations learned through necessity. They established trade relationships with Mexican villagers who were willing to exchange goods for Apache handicrafts and services. They developed early warning systems that could detect approaching military patrols days in advance. Most importantly, they maintained their cultural traditions while adapting to the changing realities of life as permanent refugees. McKenna's role in the community evolved over time from guest to member to elder. His counsel was sought on matters ranging from defense planning to settling disputes between families. The children of the band grew up knowing him as Uncle Thomas, a slightly odd but beloved figure who could be counted on for advice, practical help, and stories about the strange world of white ranchers. 5 years after leaving his ranch, McKenna received unexpected news. A Mexican trader brought word that his property had been sold by the territorial government to satisfy debts and penalties. The house where he had lived with Sarah had been burned, whether by accident or design was unclear. The graves on the hill had been left undisturbed, but were now overgrown with desert vegetation. McKenna felt sadness at the news, but also a surprising sense of relief. His old life was truly dead now, which somehow made it easier to embrace his new one completely. He had spent too many emotional energy over the years wondering about the ranch, imagining scenarios in which he might somehow return to his former existence. Now that possibility was permanently closed, and he could focus entirely on the life he had built with his adopted family. The years that followed brought both hardships and joys that McKenna could never have imagined during his solitary years. He helped deliver babies, taught young men to shoot and track, and serve as a bridge between Apache traditions and the practical realities of life in an increasingly connected world. He also discovered talents he hadn't known he possessed. McKenna proved to have a gift for diplomacy, particularly in dealing with Mexican officials and American entrepreneurs who occasionally ventured into Apache territory. His ability to speak both languages and understand both cultures made him valuable as a negotiator and interpreter. When McKenna was 60 years old, little Maria, who was no longer little, asked him to tell her children the story of how he came to be part of their family. As he sat around the fire, surrounded by faces that had become more precious to him than his own life, McKenna realized that the story wasn't about a rancher who had given refuge to desperate Apache families. It was about a man who had been lost in his own wilderness of grief and isolation until strangers had offered him something more valuable than water or food. They had offered him the chance to matter again, to be part of something larger than his own pain, and to discover that the human heart's capacity for love wasn't diminished by loss, but rather deepened by it. "The day your grandmother came to my ranch," McKenna told Maria's children, "I thought I was saving her family. But really she was saving me." As the fire died down and the families prepared for sleep, McKenna looked up at the stars that had watched over him during his years of solitude and now witnessed his contentment as part of a community. He thought about the choices that had led him from that lonely ranch to this warm circle of family and friends. He had given up everything he thought he wanted and found everything he had actually needed. He had lost his independence and found his purpose. He had abandoned his safe isolation and discovered that true security came not from walls, but from the connections that bound people together in mutual care and protection. The last entry in the journal McKenna had kept sporadically over the years read simply, "Today I realize that I am not a white man living with Apache or an Apache living in a white man's body. I'm just a human being who finally learned what it means to be part of family." It took me 50 years to understand that the most important question isn't whether we survive, but what we survive for. McKenna lived to be 78, long enough to see some of Maria's children become adults and start families of their own. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by people who mourned his passing as deeply as they had celebrated his presence among them. The Apache band buried him in their traditional manner, but they also placed on his grave a small wooden cross that he had carved himself. Not because he had remained a Christian, but because he had learned to honor all the paths that led people toward love and service to others. Years later, when Maria's children were old enough to understand the full scope of their grandfather's story, they would tell others about the white rancher who had chosen to lose everything rather than watch children go hungry and thirsty in the desert. But the story they told wasn't about heroism or sacrifice. It was about the transformative power of simple human kindness and the courage required to open one's heart to strangers. In the end, McKenna's greatest achievement wasn't the successful ranch he had built and lost, but the family he had found and the understanding that true wealth lay not in what a man could accumulate for himself, but in what he was willing to share with others. The man who had spent 12 years learning to live without people discovered that learning to live with them was the most important education of his life.